thanks so much about your great presentation. You clearly talk about both promise and the fragility of this liberty through the narrow corridor. So, s just to understand the framework, so basically we are starting from the assumption that we all want to have a liberty, right? And then the liberty can be maximally achieved if we're in that narrow corridor.
Yeah.
You explain nicely, but it's hard to get in, and it's even harder to stay in that corridor. So then for us to be there, as you said, we have to be both the state and the society have to get stronger. Then for us to achieve that, we need to have a good mobilization of society. And for that, we need also a good liberal democracy and institutions. And as a consequence, we're going to have the economic prosperity. So luckily, Korea was moving horizontally to the corridor, not like China. But then during the process, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what role the chaebol, the conglomerates, played. Can you tell us a little bit about what your take on the role of a chaebol during the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the chaebol, obviously they played an extremely important role in terms of the economic development path. The private sector has been extremely dynamic economically. They've diversified, they've taken risks, they've done all sorts of things. But I think also they probably helped, at least in the 1970s and 1980s, balance. After all, you had this military government, you had this very powerful military government. So, of course, civil society, had to organize, and civil society was responsible for contesting against the dictatorship and precipitating the democratization that took place in the late 1980s. But you could also think that the chaebol, they also helped kind of counterbalance the power of the military state. Of course, they were negotiating with it, they were cooperating with it, but I think there's also a sort of lot of, like in the book that I talked about sort of suggests this, that there was a lot of give and take in the sense of, the government didn't just get their own way, the military government didn't just get their own way, but the chaebol were the sort of most organized, in some sense, part of civil society maybe in the 1970s, and most able to kind of, push back on the state.
Okay. Yeah. Related to that, our historical process is indeed really remarkable. But then I think it raises important questions about how we distinguish two different types of social mobilization. So looking at the Korean history from the 1980s, 1980 Gwangju movement and democratization protests to recent candlelight protests and current political dynamics, how do you distinguish between healthy societal mobilization that shackles the Leviathan versus those who might destabilize in a corridor?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have
populism I'm talking about. Yeah.
I mean, I think I don't have a great social science theory, here. But I think just empirically, what I always think is what's really revealing is what people are talking about. Like what people are asking for, what people are complaining about. Tells you a lot about what's the nature of that mobilization. So in the in Why Nations Fail, we have this argument about what we call the kind of broad coalition. And when a broad coalition sort of emerges, it depends on what sort of issues they're focused on or what things they're demanding. So I think just empirically, what I would look at is what are people complaining about and what are they asking for? That's a big part of the difference.
Okay, so you also gave us a lot of useful fact about the current situation of U.S. Democrat. It's an incredible amount of distrust in government right now, which it really undermines. Then how likely do you think is that the U.S., the most exemplary nation in the corridor, can exit out of this corridor? How likely do you think it is?
I don't have probabilities on that. I think.
But then, what kind of warning signs do you care?
Well, I think it is a warning. I think it's a wake-up call. I think what we've seen in the United States in the last decade is that there's an enormous amount of discontent in society, which has been kind of papered over for years. Many of these processes have been going on for decades and decades, and the political class was either unaware of them or just incapable of doing anything to address them. So I think I can't really speak to that, but I do think, you know, it's a big wake-up call, and you know, and I think that's a possibility for reorganizing many things and rebalancing relations and recognizing that, you know, other people's opinions are maybe legitimate and worth discussing instead of dismissing. And so I think it's a moment where, of course, there's a lot of conflict and uncertainty at the moment, but the optimistic side is, you know, it's a moment where there's an opportunity to kind of reboot a lot of things, and they needed rebooting. Many things needed rebooting in the United States.
I think one of the reasons why people are questioning the democracy in the US is they think that you probably don't need democracy for economic growth. I guess they're thinking about China, for instance. Under this authoritarian government, they're doing extremely well. So people might think that, you know, democracy is not tackling the economic challenges they face. So that could be, but then we know, and you and Darren studied that it's really the democracy is actually doing pretty well, right?
Yeah.
So economic growth achieved without this social and democratic institution may not last.
Exactly.
Right? Because they don't invest in the public goods, education, and healthcare. So from very simple economic reasoning, we don't have good labor, good educated labor, so economy cannot thrive. I think it's relevant for us. Like in Korea, we are in the middle of China and the US, and fortunately, we are in the narrow corridor, but how we should navigate in this very difficult situation between the China and the US?
Well, I suspect Korea is very good at navigating. That's what you've been doing ever since. You've been doing that for 70 years. You know, I remember the first time I came to Korea, I was here with my friend Duol Kim, you know, who pointed out. He took me to the Imperial Palace and he pointed out, oh, there's a Starbucks. You know, that sign means there's a bomb shelter. There's a bomb shelter underneath the Starbucks. Like, oh, we don't have that in Chicago, you know. So I think, you know, South Korea's flourished in this immensely kind of challenging geopolitical context. Maybe it's partly a stimulant, but you know, you have to live up. You have to kind of face up to that. So I think that's not news to you. You know, the world is a challenging place. That's not news to you. You know, in fact, you know, historically it was probably even more challenging. You know, I think on democracy, you know, the research that we've done, you know, the evidence is overwhelming that democracies invest more in public goods, there's better educational attainment, there's less conflict and violence, there's higher rates of economic growth. But of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity between non-democracies. There's many different sorts of non-democracies. But my view, you know, on China, which you expressed very well, is, you know, this again, you could say, this is you know, I started by talking about liberty and whether there are sort of universals of human society. Of course, that's why South Korea is so nice, you know, because you did create this very vibrant democracy. You did create a lot of liberty here, and you see all the economic benefits from that. But you could say, is that really a human universal? You know, my view on China is power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think maybe China's different, and there's other mechanisms, but I don't see any evidence to make me change my mind on that.
Yeah, I guess always the challenge is an opportunity for us to be creative. And I think one of the reasons why the democracy is struggling these days is the inequality, I think. Because the fruit of this liberty and democracy is the prosperity, right?
Yeah.
And inequality means we are not really sharing the fruits. So I think in some ways, we really have to do. I mean, in Korea too, we have a lot of inequalities. I mean, 벼락거지. I mean, I think the Koreans will know there are a lot of resentment about those, and especially the housing is a big issue. So I think I'm asking you for you to focus on these inequalities. In some way, in what ways we may be creative in this situation.
No, I mean, you know, so I mean that's the inequality story is sort of implicit in that data on wages I put up there. I think, you know, the problem, you know, in many democracies is that you know, they've been immensely successful, but the world changes. You know, technology changes, computers diffuse, the world becomes far more globalized. You know, there's structural changes, and you have to adapt to that. And democracies have not adapted to that. You know, they haven't adapted to changes in the labor market, or many of these things that have changed the wage structure and have been associated with enormous increases in inequality, and they haven't adapted to that. Of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity. You know, Sweden adapted better than Britain or the United States did, you know. But I think that's, so, you know, institutions are never kind of set once and then never, you know, you always have to adapt, you have to change. And I think that's why when I'm talking about rebooting, that's a lot of what I mean. You know, we need new ideas for how to reinstitutionalize this liberal democratic system to try to deal with some of these problems. I think, you know, the Korean case, it depends on what data you look at. You know, it's interesting that if you look at many measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, for example, or even the share of national income accruing to the richest 10%, then Korea has managed to implement this transformation with very little change in inequality. It's dramatically different from China, for example, because China started with socialism or whatever, so the initial conditions were different. But what you do see in Korea in the last couple of decades is the very top, like the 1% or the 0.1% have got a lot richer in Korea in the last 20 years. So you don't see it in many measures of inequality, which is kind of extremely interesting. But now you do see it right at the top. You know, I think that's got something to do with globalization. It's got to do with many of these mechanisms like CEO pay. You're competing, you know, in this global market for talent, you know, in the business world. You know, if you want to attract people or keep people, then you have to pay these enormous sort of salaries. So Korea can't isolate itself from that. But I think, you know, if I stood back and asked how has Korea managed this transition, you know, in this inequality space, I'd say actually it's done much better than most societies.
Yeah, I think, as you said, it's very heterogeneous. I think the situation in Korea is very uniquely different from other countries, especially we heard a lot about this housing situation, and a lot of wealth is concentrated. Therefore, all the monetary policy and fiscal policy that affects, you know, capital gain taxes or the tax on wealth it's all very delicate, and it has potentially, you know, aggravate already, you know, those populistic movements. So the civil movements may not be really in the interest of nation. It might be in the interest of those groups they are representing. So that's why I was, you know, the most important movements, right? We need the social mobilization, but that mobilization may, in this kind of situation, may turn into something that could destabilize instead of concentrating.
If you thought about the recent history of Korea, there's been, you know, social mobilization that protected the democracy against the declaration of martial law. So, you know, that's a pretty functional type of social mobilization, I would say. Yeah.
Yes. Well, given the time, I will ask you the last question. I know, even though you got the Nobel Prize, I understand that you don't have an answer for everything, but there is a big elephant in the room for Koreans, right? North Korea. Obviously, North Korea is not in the corridor. In what ways do you think, I mean, whether it's possible, and if yes, what's the path for North Korea to get into corridor, you think?
Yeah. Well, you know, I guess this comes back to my claim about, you know, human universals, in the sense that, you know, my view, you know, at least wherever I've worked anywhere in the world, is, you know, people are, you know, humans, we share this deep kind of ancestral history. And, you know, so my view is that people value liberty wherever they are, you know, and the problem in North Korea is that the regime, you know, won't give people liberty. So I think, you know, I think what's fascinating about North Korea is, you know, you see what's happened in China, for example, you see what's happened in Vietnam. They made these sort of transitions. They created an enormous amount of wealth. The North Koreans know that's happening, and they don't do it. They still don't do it. So why is that? Because the regime is much more personalized. It's not institutionalized in the way of the Vietnamese regime or the Chinese. So they're too worried about losing power if they change. So I don't think the North Korean regime is going to change. You know, the only way it's going to change is if people rise up and overthrow it, you know, or it engages in some ludicrous interstate warfare and is defeated. You know, many regimes like that lose power as a consequence of warfare. But I think that's why they sound a lot, they talk a lot, but actually they don't do anything because they actually understand. They understand that's one of the things that could really imperil the regime. So I think it's a very difficult situation. It's absolutely devastating for the ordinary person in North Korea to live, in that world. But I think that's, what's the chance that such an event will happen? I have no idea, but the world is full of surprising events. I was a student when the Soviet Union collapsed, and nobody predicted that. I had friends who were training to be Sovietologists, and they didn't know it was going to happen. So maybe, something exciting will happen in North Korea.
Yeah, we'll see. But thank you for trying to give an answer to this hard question. So with that, James, your framework, I think it's fascinating, really giving us a way to understand what's going on here. So now with that, we can close our discussion and open the floor for the audience questions. So please, if you have questions, let us know.
네, 멋진 강연과 토론 감사드립니다. 제 질문은 예전보다 노동력이 점점점 경제에서 차지하는 비중이 줄어들고 있는 와중에도 민주주의가 계속해서 작동을 잘 하고 내로 코리더에 대한 답이 될 수 있는지, 특히 뭐 AI나 4차 산업 이런 걸로 가면서 이제 기존의 3차 산업에 많은 대중들에게 많은 리소스가 돌아가야 했던 상황들이 근본적으로 바뀔 수 있다라고 뭐 경고하시는 분들이 많기 때문에 거기에 대한 생각을 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what the impact of artificial intelligence is on this equilibrium is pretty hard to understand. When I received the Nobel Prize in December in Stockholm, there were five scholars who were receiving the Nobel Prize for their work on artificial intelligence, and none of them agreed on what the consequences of artificial intelligence are. I think if you look at it from an economic perspective, the thing that's most worrying, leaving aside all the sort of science fiction of artificial general intelligence that I don't really have a very well-informed view on, is, if you think about the labor market consequences, it's somehow the logic of American capitalism to sort of substitute labor with machines. Like one thing that really puzzles me is this obsession with driverless vehicles, for example. Like, I've never seen an economic computation that sort of says, yeah, this is really where we want to focus innovation. This is the really kind of high social payoff to substituting truck drivers and Uber drivers and replacing them with, but anyway, it's happening. So there's an enormous amount of replacement of labor, and in some sense, it's very similar to that dynamic that I showed you. Like, what is it that's created all these falling wages for low-educated workers in the United States? That's exactly, part of it is, outsourcing production to China or whatever, but a lot of it has to do with computerization of tasks and employment relations, and the fact that computers are much more complementary with high-skilled, college-educated workers, and substitution. So I think that's going to go on steroids in some sense. So I think there's going to be enormous consequences for the labor market, pushing wages down even further down than they are now. But I think in some sense, that's a kind of choice. That's what's so, there's nothing inevitable about that. Like I was just saying, there's no reason why the technology pushes in the direction of replacing humans with robots. The way I think about AI, for example, how has AI affected what I do? Well, it's been fantastic. It's actually allowed me to start a couple of research projects that I've known for 10 years, but I haven't been able to implement them because it was just too much work, just impossible. I'd need a research team of 50 people to do that. But now you can do it with AI. It's absolutely extraordinary. So for me, it's fabulous. The way I think about it is, well, it's making me more productive. It's like, that would have taken me a week to do now. And that would have taken me a week, and now I can do it in half an hour. That's fabulous. I got a week of my life back. So I think, okay, I'm an academic, it's a very specific job, very specific tasks and whatever. But that's how we should be thinking about it. We shouldn't be thinking about, let's fire the Uber drivers and replace them with robots. We should be thinking about, how do we make people work? But how do we make the Uber drivers more effective? How do we make them, work more productive? I mean, that's. But I think somehow the logic at the moment is similar to what we've been experiencing for the last 50 years, and that I find sort of frightening. It's going to have all these social consequences, the sort I was sort of alluding to. I don't have time to describe them, but I don't think there's anything inevitable about the technology. Could we do something about that? Could government regulate it in a way that pushes it? I don't know. I mean, that's not where we are at the moment. Yeah.
So is there any other question? We can take one short question from the floor.
Thank you. I'm curious, you presented the data about real wage change and also this picture of growing distrust in educational institutions. And one might think that if you see that wages will only grow for folks who are more educated, there would be a drive towards education. What do you think creates that sort of unconventional response, or how do we address the tension between education as a solution, potential solution, and this clear driver that is antagonistic towards the institutions of education?
Well, it's more about access to education and or attitudes towards education. I think also, Michael Sandel, if you've read the political philosopher Michael Sandel's book on the tyranny of meritocracy, Michael has this idea of, people talk a lot about redistributive justice in the United States, but, what you really need is something like contributive justice, Like, I have a very good friend who I went to college with in London, many years ago, who's a truck driver, okay? So and he loves it. He loves being a truck driver. And so he could have got a different job. He could have got a job in a bank. He could have become whatever. But he didn't. He wanted some space to do his own thing and whatever. And Michael Sandel's point is that's a contribution to society. We should respect that. Let's start. Before we start thinking about how we solve this problem through education or whatever, let's stop thinking of the truck driver as the Harvard dropout and just respect their contribution to society. So I think that Michael's book is a very good place to start on that.
Well, thank you so much. With this, our time's up, so we'll conclude this session. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, James, particularly.
Okay.
Thank you.